It has long been said that the oldest and most primal fear of mankind is the fear of the unknown. And whilst you could take this idea and run in a million different directions with it, I think the most common example in modern and ancient society is the fear of the dark. How many times have you experienced the sensation of unnerving paranoia for no other reason than the fact that you can't quite see what could possibly be lurking in the corner or underneath the bed? After all, the darkness not only conceals whatever is lurking inside, but also has come to represent the very idea of the unknown itself. So it's hardly surprising that the concept of light versus dark has been used so many times over the years throughout different types of media. The more instinct-heavy fear and suspicion is widely used in the horror market to invoke a sense of dread and anxiety, which eventually builds to an elevated sense of suspense. Wow, try saying that 5 times fast. And on the other side of the coin, you have the more metaphorical side of the idea, usually the light representing the good guys and darkness representing the bad guys. And whilst I'm sure that this sort of allegory initially came from some religious context, its use in popular culture to tell stories cannot be understated. Think of Star Wars using the light and dark side of the Force, Harry Potter's use of the dark arts, Sauron from Lord of the Rings being referred to as the Dark Lord. There are countless examples of this trope used throughout film, novels, theatre, and video games. But there's one game that I want to talk about that makes use of this idea both literally and metaphorically in a pretty unique way that is somehow integral to the plot, but never comes to define it. A game released 11 years ago that saw little sales upon its initial release, and almost seems to have been all but forgotten. This was Alan Wake. The game begins with Alan Wake, a best-selling crime fiction author taking a vacation in the small town of Bright Falls, Washington with his wife Alice. Alan is suffering from writer's block and can't seem to spark any ideas for his new novel. The two end up taking this trip in hope that Alan will find some kind of inspiration to write his next book. After arriving in town, Alan visits the landlord of the cabin they rented in order to pick up the keys, but ends up bumping into a creepy old lady instead. She says that the landlord has fallen ill and entrusted her to hand over the keys. Later on, they arrive at the cabin and Alice reveals an old typewriter to Alan. She says that she thinks it would be a good idea for him to try and write something, and that she's arranged for him to see local psychologist Dr. Emil Hartman to try to cure his writer's block. Alan doesn't take too kindly to this and storms out of the cabin, only to hear Alice scream for help. He rushes back up to find that she's been dragged from the cabin and pulled into the lake. Immediately he dives in after her, only to pass out and wake up around a week later in the wreck of a car crash. It's here that the main journey of the game begins, as the player, controlling Alan, seeks out to find Alice and solve the mystery surrounding Bright Falls. Alan discovers pages throughout his journey to a manuscript titled Departure, ostensibly written by himself. Despite not being able to recall writing a single line, the story inked into the pages appears to be coming to life around him. Alan seems to be the protagonist of his own story, with the antagonist being a mysterious dark force with the ability to take control of inanimate objects and even people. I'm not going to run through every plot point as it's not really necessary for this video, but I am going to throw some relevant details out there to give context as to what I'm going to talk about later. So upon arriving at the cabin, we learn that Alice has a crippling phobia of the dark. Later on in a flashback, we learn that Alan got over his fear of the dark in his childhood when his mother gave him the clicker, which would fight back the darkness. Much later on in the game, we learn that an entity known as the Dark Presence is trapped within the lake near the cabin and has the ability to bring works of fiction to life. The ultimate goal of the Dark Presence is presumably to manipulate talented artists into writing itself into becoming more powerful, or even to free itself from the captivity of the lake. It tried the same thing years prior with a poet named Thomas Zane. However, Zane realized what the entity was trying to do and used his writings to sink the island and write himself, and by proxy anything he previously created, out of existence. Which is why, when Barry, Alan's agent, arrives in Bright Falls, he mentions doing some research into Thomas Zane but can't manage to find any record of his existence. Before his disappearance, Zane wrote a note that any of his belongings kept inside of a shoebox would not fade away with him and would remain in the waking world. He also noted that a character called Alan Wake would one day arrive and destroy the darkness with the clicker, which poses this dilemma of how much of Alan's story was already a predetermined sequence of events. The fear of the dark is obviously an already fairly common ideology in real life, so I don't think that it draws too much attention to itself when you encounter characters in Alan Wake that share this paranoia. However, upon closer inspection, you really come to realise how much the themes of this game are foreshadowed ahead of time and throughout the gameplay experience. The obvious examples being Alice with her nyctophobia and Alan's childhood fear presented through flashbacks. But there are instances at the start of the game that aren't quite as narratively crammed down your throat. Take when you arrive at the diner to pick up the keys from Stucky, and come across Cynthia Weaver, an old lady local to the town, cowering with a lantern in hand and toggling the light switch on and off. She warns us to be careful when making our way down the dark hallway, and it's easy to write her off by thinking she's a crazy old lady, but with the knowledge of the role she plays later in the game, and the very real threat of the dark presence, it quickly becomes apparent just how much the developers cared about this story. There's also a section a little later on at the start of Chapter 2, where Alan finds himself inside the town's police station and comes across a local man locked in a cell, presumably for a drunken disorderly charge. He begs Alan to turn the lights on, and if you do, he comes across as genuinely grateful, incessantly thanking you and telling you that you're a great guy. And you can always turn them back off again, which he doesn't take to so kindly. It's actually really interesting to see how many of the residents of Bright Falls have this adverse yet subconscious fear of the dark, despite not entirely being aware of the entity or its power. It does seem to draw some similarities to the town of Derry in Stephen King's It. In that story, Pennywise only seems to make an active attempt to capture and eat the children of the town. He doesn't seem particularly interested in feasting on the grown-ups themselves, yet he somehow still seems to have some form of power over them. The kids of the Losers Club aren't able to rely on their parents for help or even comfort, as they just don't seem interested. It's not that they think the kids are lying, they just don't think the children's disappearances are that big of a deal, as if the town is covered in some sort of perception filter. There's one for you Doctor Who fans out there. I think that is one of the scariest things about that book. Your parents should make you feel safe and secure, yet the town ends up making the kids feel trapped, isolated, and alone. I think it's possible that the dark presence residing in the Lake of Bright Falls makes use of a similar tactic. The fact that no one seems to be on Alan's side throughout the game other than Barry does seem a little strange, as the whole town is constantly on edge, despite not really knowing why. When Alan tries to explain his wife's disappearance to Sheriff Sarah Breaker, she tells him that the island and cabin that he's referring to haven't existed since the 70s. The mysterious entity is playing mind games with Alan and trying to keep him isolated from everybody else. And depending on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, you could argue that the similarity to It may be the result of the entity's power to take elements from works of fiction and bring them to reality. Maybe someone in the town was reading that book and the dark presence itself took inspiration from the story. Or I'm just digging way too deep. But speaking of Stephen King, the game opens with a monologue from Alan, in which he refers to a quote by King. Nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. The quote comes from an article that King wrote for Entertainment Weekly titled "Why Hollywood Can't Do Horror," and his argument does have merit. He mentions some of the movies that he found the scariest to be Halloween, Night of the Living Dead, and The Blair Witch Project. In Halloween, we're left with so many questions about Michael Myers. Why doesn't he speak? How is he so strong? Why is he so evil? In Night of the Living Dead, what sparked the beginning of the zombie apocalypse? And did the police officers realize their mistake in the end after they shot Ben? In The Blair Witch Project, what is the Blair Witch? What does she look like? What happened to Josh at the end? If we're to use King's ideology, the lack of definitive answers and explanations is integral to maintaining the suspense and perpetual dread that these films invoke. So despite the antagonist being a literal personification of darkness itself, this isn't just the standard light versus dark cliche that we've seen a million times before. I think that if you tried to cross-examine the idea of the dark acting as a vessel for the unknown with Stephen King's theory of understanding kills the suspense, you could come to the conclusion that in Alan Wake, the entity represents the element of mystery that can only be penetrated by the power of light, which serves itself as a metaphorical stand-in for knowledge. In the gameplay, Alan has to shine his flashlight towards the Taken to break down their defences, and once weakened, they can be killed via traditional means, primarily gunfire. As you progress, you get your hands on heavier weaponry like shotguns and hunting rifles, and more efficient light sources like the heavy-duty flashlight, and eventually the lantern. It seems that when the residents of Bright Falls are taken by the darkness, that it sort of obscures their weaknesses, as even the shotgun doesn't have any effect on them without first shining your flashlight. To tie it into this metaphor we've established, the light source from the torch exposes the enemy's weakness by revealing what was once hidden by the mystery of the dark. The enemies in Alan Wake cannot be defeated by simple brute force and mindless violence. The game asks that you look past that and seek to reveal the truth by using the only source of light available to you and literally burn through the fiction that the entity has created. Nowhere is this more apparent than in this segment in the late game. Alan uses his torch to shine a light onto a series of words scattered throughout the world, as if written on a page, to reveal the actual objects that the words represent. At this point, the Dark Presence is trying to deceive Alan by trapping him in a fictional world. The word barrel is written out in glowing letters above the ground because that's all that the entity can perceive it to be, just words. The darkness doesn't understand the concept of perfect imperfection. It tries to use Alan the same way it tried to use Thomas Zane, to use his art form to will things to life, and then later try to imitate this by creating apparitions itself. But Alan doesn't buy it for a minute, because what he sees is so far removed from reality, it couldn't possibly be real. Once the Dark Presence takes control of something or even creates its own fiction, it reduces everyone and everything down to their most basic purpose: a plot device. As it's trying to trap Alan down in the dark place, it attempts to make him believe that he'd been dreaming up until that point. Alan sees Alice and asks her to turn on the light, but she tells him that the power's out and that he should come back to bed. Now obviously, if we know anything about Alice, it's that she's petrified of the dark, so this simply cannot be her. The Dark Presence just sees Alice for her relevance to Alan's plot, if you will. She's the supportive wife that praises anything that Alan lays a finger on, not an actual person with a personality and traits of her own. When the entity takes control of people, they seem to just mindlessly quip about their professions. Police officers sort of blurt out, "You have the right to remain silent," while Rose, the waitress from the local diner, mumbles her usual spiel from work. In the Dark Presence's story, the characters don't have depth. There is no allegory to pick out from anybody's actions. Alice serves as Alan's perfect muse for his writing, despite the fact that she's not a perfect person. But that's what makes art so engaging. A character's imperfections is what drives the focus to them developing over time. Going back to Star Wars, if Luke had just mastered the power of the Force on Dagobah straight away, it would have only served as a detriment to his character. He needed to get easily distracted, he needed to have little to no patience, he needed to fail. In A New Hope, he started out rather cocky and didn't really believe in the Force enough to be able to control it. It's only during the climax, when he turns off his targeting computer and lets go, does he actually manage to use it. Despite becoming more powerful across the trilogy, the flaws in his character still got him into situations that could have been avoided. He often underestimated his enemies or possibly overestimated himself. Even at the end of Return of the Jedi, Luke only really defeated Vader because he tapped into that raw power of the dark side. He was constantly learning and developing throughout his journey. This is why people don't really seem to like Rey very much in the sequel trilogy. She has a very similar origin story to Luke. She grew up poor, without parents, on a barren desert planet, and has a natural talent for flying. However, as soon as she's introduced to the concept of the Force, she seems to pick it up straight away. Consider this. Anakin Skywalker, the literal chosen one, turned to the dark side to try to learn the ability to stop those he cared about from dying, but even he couldn't accomplish this. Rey, however, managed to do this with very little training or effort in the third movie of her trilogy. They explain this away by saying she's uber powerful because she's related to Palpatine, but it doesn't matter. Even if it makes sense in the plot for a character to be perfect, it still doesn't make for an interesting story or a character worth being invested in. Alan knows this. He understands that you can't cheat your way out of the situation, which is why in the game's climax, when he finishes writing Departure, he frees Alice from the lake but traps himself there in her place. He states that there needs to be a balance, and this is what the Dark Presence fails to understand. I guess that one could perceive this idea itself to be an allegory for corporate art versus art of passion. I think that most people can watch a film like Joker or Parasite, and whether you enjoyed it or not, realise that a lot of work went into telling this story and that it was a passion project for the crew. I don't think most people would say the same for Fast and Furious Hobbs and Shaw. Overall, I think Alan Wake is a story about stories and what inspires them to be. Alan himself has multiple people who inspire him to write, albeit for different reasons, and each one with their own agenda. Alice is the loving, supportive life partner that just wants to be the best for her husband. Barry at first seems a little pushy and perhaps on the selfish side, as he only really seems interested in getting Alan's next story so that he can make a quick buck. However, towards the game's climax, we come to realise just how dependent Ali and Barry are on each other, and how much their friendship means to the pair of them. Dr. Hartman tries to manipulate Alan into writing for his own benefit, and sees him as not much more than a tool to accomplish this goal. And quite similarly, the Dark Presence serves as a dark cloud, hovering over Alan's shoulder, guiding him in the direction to make itself more powerful, but it is limited by what can be written into a story. During one section, we discover that before Zane sunk the island and removed himself from the equation, he wrote one final page. Alan, 7 years old, would fight sleep to the bitter end. When he did sleep, he soon woke up, screaming, the nightmares fresh in his mind. One evening, his mother, sitting by his bed, offered him an old light switch. She called it the clicker, and flicking the switch would turn on a magical light that would drive the beast away. From this, we can learn that Zane wrote the clicker into Alan's life, or possibly even created Alan himself. This creates this dilemma where we must ask ourselves, how much free will does Alan have throughout the game? Surely he can only act out what is printed on the manuscript pages that he wrote during his blackout. But that means that he had control from the very beginning then, as he wrote what he would later do. But then again, he may only exist in the first place because of what Thomas Zane wrote down on his final page. It's a minefield, I tell you. I guess that my interpretation of the story is that Zane is not so much a creative force bending people to the will of his creation, as much as he's a guiding light. In the same way that Gandalf sort of gives Bilbo a nudge out of the door, Zane isn't in control of every moment that we play through. He just started us off on our journey and provided us with the tools to see what was previously hidden from us. Alan Wake is a story about stories, but it's also a story about art and the effects that it can have on us as a society. Well-crafted stories, lovable characters, relatable songs have on more than one occasion managed to save lives. Obviously, not every piece of art is going to be created for what can be considered the right reasons, but through inspiration, passion, and appreciation, we can hopefully shine a little more light in the dark.